Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Mark Moyer, author of Win Again. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Are you ready to get started?
I absolutely am.
All right, let's do this. Question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
The most important thing, I think, is to continue forging ahead. Every time you run into a roadblock, every time you run into hurdles, remind yourself of the end. In other words, think about the prize. Think about you holding that book in your hand for the first time like I did and looked at it and said, holy cow, I can't believe this has actually happened. And that you've got something that will cement your legacy going forward, that you've written a book. So every time you face any sort of challenges or something in the editorial part or brain freeze, whatever it is, keep looking at the big picture and the big prize at the end.
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Well, to me, I think the hardest part of it, especially writing a sort of a nonfiction book and a business book, is really trying to understand what it is you're trying to get to the reader and really anticipate what is it the reader really wants to read and what's the benefit they're going to truly get. But once you've conceptualized all that, assuming you really know your material, sometimes the writing part is actually a lot easier because it's just coming right out of your mind. It's coming right out of your brain. But what's most important to me anyway is that the content itself really needs to be something that, in my mind, helps my reader, helps really get them to a much higher level.
Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that has worked well.
One of the things that I use quite frequently, I continue to use it to this, in fact, this very hour, is I'm a big fan not just of social media in general, but more importantly of LinkedIn. Partially because, in my opinion, 99% of users do not leverage the full force that LinkedIn really carries. And to me, what you can do all day long, every day, all the time, is put in excerpts from a chapter, a book, any sort of piece of what you've written, and attach a link to where you're selling it via, whether it's Amazon or however you're selling it. But LinkedIn is perfectly happy and okay as long as you're providing value, as long as you are providing content that benefits the reader. You can also certainly pitch your book, and it's basically free advertising, especially if you start sharing it not just with your network, but you share it with groups, and it could be all kinds of different groups that fall under the umbrella of the audience you're trying to reach.
Now, you're talking about specific groups that are in LinkedIn?
Correct. Yes. So, for example, if you're writing a book, in my case, it was all about helping athletes make a transition. I might be sharing it with, for example, the NFL Players Association group, or I might be, or with NCAA student athletes groups and that sort of thing. So it's something where you can then potentially reach an audience of many 100,000 people versus just the people in your network.
When you bring up a great point, talking about specifically posting in those groups. So let's say you join the group and then you want to do a post. What's a good way to do that in a non-salesy way that it is providing value? I mean, are you talking about like you do an intro? Hey, my name is Mark. This is my book. Or what type of approach did you take when you're doing those initial posts into those specific groups?
Well, that's a great question. You can't necessarily start by, in my opinion, you don't start by saying, hey, I'm Mark and this is what I do. I start off with the actual content. I'll say, for example, I might say the 5 most important things to understand before you go into an interview are A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you'd like more great tips on how to ace your interview, make sure to grab my book. You can catch it here on this link, so-and-so.com, and you'll be able to read much more about this important topic.
And see, that's absolutely perfect. This is the way you're giving the value. You're like, hey, if you want more information, you can get my information here. That's perfect, because any type of situation where you're using the 5 best points or the 10 best points, that always seems to get a hook, and people always want to read it. Okay, what are the 5 best points on this? And so clearly that worked out well for you when you did that.
Absolutely.
How many times did you post in those groups, especially when it's getting closer to your launch?
I'm okay doing it every couple of days, actually. Or you can do it every day where you share it in a different type of group every day. So in other words, if you've got the 5 most important tips of blank, and you can share it in one group one day, another group the next day, another group the next day, because a lot of times the people within those groups don't necessarily intersect. Secondly, people don't always look at the different stories in the feed and so forth. So you're not necessarily no one's going to be upset seeing it twice, because no one likely will see it twice. So there's nothing wrong with putting the same material out there all week long, and then the following week shifting to a different set of tips. But it's okay to keep on doing it, keep on going. No one, there's nobody that, I mean, if they get conceptually upset with how often you're posting, they'll just they'll delete it or ignore you or whatever it is. But that doesn't matter. It's okay to, it's all a numbers game on LinkedIn. You really want to, reach the biggest audience possible.
And what about general posts? Will you also post in your feed as well, in addition to the groups?
Absolutely. And what I do is I try to, in my case, I've got a few different things that I market, whether it's my coaching or my podcast or the book or a variety of things. But I always like to have links to sort of everything within each of my posts. And it can be posts about, I'll give you an example. My small university was in the NCAA tournament, and we had a very close loss to Tennessee in the first round. I just did a simple post about that, and I there was nothing attached, no value other than we did great, and here's a little video about it. And it got somewhere close to 3,000 views now, and got all kinds of people reaching out to me and just connecting and saying hello. And so to me, it's a great way for every author, potential author, business person, etc., to truly leverage everything that a vehicle like LinkedIn has to offer.
What are your views on hashtags on LinkedIn?
So I use them mostly because I shouldn't make myself sound ancient, but I have a social media manager. She helps me with a lot of things. And she basically said, Marks, you got to start using these things. And so I get it. And for example, with mine, I use ones that are specific to my podcast. And I also do hashtag win again, among others. So from what I understand, it's super important. I don't, to be perfectly blunt and honest, I don't use them to find other people and other topics yet, but I certainly use them when I list a story or an article.
And what do you feel is the sweet spot when it comes to the amount of hashtags? We had a guest on a show recently, and they were saying usually no more than 8 hashtags. What are your thoughts on that?
I typically do only about 4 or 5 myself. What I do instead, actually, is in the comments section, I might write another comment that ties in with the article or the post I just did, but then I will tag specific people, and I'll tag 30 or 40 people that are either fairly big influencers out there and or are people in my network that might have a specific interest in the content. Because then when you tag them, they get a message that you've tagged them. They look at the article, and they'll often share it, like it, post it, etc. So the amount of people you can reach multiplies.
And these influencers, these are people that you already had relationships with, right?
Yes. I mean, it's all people that I'm connected with. There might be a couple occasionally here and there that I'm not, but it's almost always people that But I have a pretty big network, so it's big enough right now that I can pick people that I'm connected to. But I mean, look, at the end of the day, if you want to share it with Mark Cuban or Richard Branson or something, that's fine. I don't think he or she or some of those people may necessarily look at it. They probably get a couple 100,000 of these every day, but but I tend to, I'm fairly well established in my niche, and so I think people that when they see my content and they're exposed to it, they're more than happy to share it to their network.
That's cool. I love that you mentioned that too, because that's what I found too. A lot of influencers, I mean, obviously not the cumulative Branson, so to speak, but some more mid-range guys, they're usually pretty helpful with that, especially if you're adding value.
Well, that's the key thing with all of this. And I think many people have a tendency to expect others to help them. And what I try to say is, look, always provide your value first. Always lead with your message and what you bring to the table, and things will follow. Um, you know, One other thing is that people say, "Oh, Mark, why did you basically include your entire coaching program in your book? Aren't you worried that someone will just read your book and not necessarily need to hire you?" And I said, "Look, I can put everything I say on paper, but people still want to be dealt with one-on-one or dealt with directly, or have a phone call about it, or feel like they're dealing with me one-on-one, or really getting more engaged. So they'll always call me. And for the ones that don't, that's okay. At least they're getting some great value out of it." The books that I don't like are the ones that I read, and I've read plenty of them, that are 90% upsell pitch and 10% content.
Yeah, and that's always my philosophy. I was talking about this. We did a market. We do a marketing 101 event every month locally here in Arlington. And one of the things I always talk about is I give everything I have away for free. And people looked at me like, "For free?" I said, "Yes. What I charge for is implementation." You could learn how to do everything possible about publishing or podcasting, but the thing is, most people don't want to learn how to do this stuff themselves. They want someone who they trust and knows going to get the job done. And that's how we've had record revenue the last 4 months running, is the fact that we give everything away for free, but what we charge for is the implementation and working together. But it's like you said, it's not an upsell. It's like, hey, here is everything. This is everything that you need. But if you do want to work together and get additional support, then we can help you.
Spot on. It's interesting because it's funny you mentioned that, because I was advising somebody on how to make changes to their LinkedIn profile to make them much more visible, much more interesting, be able to promote their business more and that sort of thing. And the guy just said, "Well, can you just do it for me?" I was like, "What?" I said, "Well, I guess I can add, like, I don't know, $1,000 to you." He goes, "Please do it." I was like, "Alrighty then." So you're absolutely right, Paul. It's interesting that there are a whole lot of people. We just, unfortunately, a lot of us just don't have time to do things. And if you're the person that can implement and do it properly and efficiently and accurately and all that sort of thing, then of course you're hired, right?
Yeah, well, it totally changed our business, especially with publishing, because we focused at first a few years back on coaching, on one-on-one coaching, on group coaching, and that still does well. But what really changed our business model was when we started to promote more of our done-for-you services. So we have like a book publishing service, a book launch marketing service, an executive ghostwriting service, and that's the biggest thing I've learned, at least in my industry, is that people don't want to learn how to do this. They want to pay me and my team to make sure they're properly taken care of, and they pay premium to do it. But the thing is, I think it also buys them assurance. It buys them relief, where they don't have to worry about this stuff. They can just have you do it for them. And I think it's the same thing with you. When a person asked if, hey, would you help me? Would you just do this for me? Then it just buys them that relief.
You're absolutely right. And you know what? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that if they feel like they're leaving it in the hands of someone who really knows their stuff and it has that expertise, then they're okay with it.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Well, so it's like asking me who my favorite child is or something, and I won't tell you that either. But one of my favorite books, but the one I want to talk about today, is a book by Perry Marshall called 80/20 Sales and Marketing.
Yes.
And I love that book because it's jam-packed with so much great content that the way I value a book, especially a business book, is I take a lot of notes. And if I fill up a legal pad, then that's a great book. If I've just got 1 or 2 pages scribbled on, then that's not a good book. But in this case here, Perry talks about a whole wide variety of ways to implement the 80/20, the Pareto principle, which I think is great. But one of the things that I really caught from it that I thought was interesting, that I'll share with you super fast, I hope, is the concept of what he calls the power curve, which is basically a graph or a curve where you see it sort of a slow increase in elevation, and then it suddenly spikes straight up. And what his analogy was, and I'll interpret it for everybody here just to make it a lot easier, is if you can imagine being at a baseball game at Yankee Stadium and there's 50,000 fans there. Well, 40,000 fans may have paid between, for argument's sake, $10 and $30. And so that is the long sort of slope that's just a gradual slope. And then maybe 4,000 or 5,000 paid between 30 and 50. And so the slope starts to increase. But then there's going to be maybe 1,000 that paid between, let's say, $100 and $300. And then there's going to be 20 people that paid $1,000 to be there. Now, what Perry argues and what he talks about is that the constant there is everybody is watching the same Yankees baseball game. They're all deriving the same product. But the person that paid $10 is probably sitting in a seat in the bleachers. The person that paid $1,000 is in a suite somewhere, and maybe he or she had a chance to tour the locker room, maybe had lunch with a former Yankee, a former baseball player, got some other perks, got some free beer and free everything else. And what he says is that as a business person, we should all be focusing on those $1,000 people because they're not necessarily getting 100 times the value that the $10 person is getting. Maybe they're getting 8 times or 20 times the value, not a full 100 times the value, but they feel like they're getting 100 times the value because of everything else that's being thrown at them. So his argument is that we can put together a product that seems like it's worth $1,000, and it actually truly may be worth $1,000, and that's certainly worth $1,000 to the consumer. And you obviously only need to sell, one of those for 100 of those $10 people. So I thought that was a really interesting way to look at things. It's why I don't flinch about the amount of money I charge people, because I know that they're getting that value.
Yep.
But it's sort of, I thought that was a great way to reinforce it. So.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I read that book about a year ago and just absolutely loved it. And it just makes so much sense and so much logic business-wise.
Absolutely.
Well, for our final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
So, I have lots of favorites, but I was going to say, I was going to pick one of my own only because, and I know that's sort of a bit of a cop-out, but it's one of these things where what I do for a living, I spend my day giving people advice, and I'm a very, very good person at giving others advice, whether it's for their career, their business, whatever it might be. But the irony is that, and this is the same for many people that are involved in coaching and advisory work, is a lot of times they have a little trouble heeding their own advice. It's what you always hear when people say, do as I say, not as I do. And one thing I wanted to do was make T-shirts and sell them on my website and that sort of thing that said the following. It would say, please take my advice. I'm not using it. And I thought that was a great idea, except for the part where I realized, well, geez, all my clients would probably say, wait a second, you're not using your own advice? I don't know about this. So I didn't really pursue that. But I love that quote because when you read it and you sort of look at it, it takes a second to kick in, but once you see it, it makes complete sense.
Absolutely. And I do love that quote. I know we talked about it before the show. I'm like, yeah, you probably need to get that trademarked.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. I was told by a trademark lawyer that I need to make a business out of it before I can trademark it. So in other words, it's not just making a T-shirt, but I have to have a website. I have to do all. And I was like, oh, geez, really? So I don't know. We'll see.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Go to my website, www.markmoyer.com, markmoyer.com. And the book is Win Again on Amazon and on my website. And you can listen to my Make Your Mark podcast anytime.
Well, Mark, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Appreciate it, Paul, and you too.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.